Hello all. Welcome to APUSH Unit 3, the second part of this unit. Here I'll be discussing political effects that stemmed from the American Revolution, so the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. I'll also be covering a little extra stuff, but that's primarily what I'm going to talk about, the politics behind everything. I apologize for how long the last video was. That's my bad, guys, but there was a lot in there, and I may have rambled, but it was still very important. So, let's move forward into the direct effects of the American Revolution. But before we get into any of this stuff here, let's talk about land. So, before the American Revolution, the colonies had their own boundary lines set up by the Proclamation of 1763 by the Appalachian Mountains. However, after the American Revolution, the states had a new boundary by the Mississippi River. So now we have a whole new sect of land. So what do we do with that land? We use it to expand our civilization and our nation. That's what these ordinances are all for. How do we indoctrinate more states into the United States of America? So moving on to these first two ordinances, the Ordinance of 1774 primarily sets up this, like, it establishes what you need to become a state, and it divides the land properly. Where if you have this amount of land, this amount of people in there, so if you have a population, if you meet the population requirement, if you have a state charter and a state government, then you're good. The Ordinance of 1775 kind of just enhances the actual division of the land using a grid system. The Northwest Ordinance, in my opinion, is the most important, as it is very controversial. Because, as you can see, you must support religious freedom and no slavery. No slavery. If you remember from last video, that's kind of a big no-no for the South. Oh, crap. That's kind of a big no-no for the South. Because, remember, during the American Revolution, the British came into the South and they were going to free some slaves. And that's the whole reason that Southerners kind of rebelled against the British, despite not really being like against them, like despite not having any gripes with them. So already prohibiting slavery in new states was already quelling up some tensions, and that also kind of explains why the distribution of land and indoctrination of states changed heavily within the next couple decades in the next unit. So this will more so be discussed in two-ish videos. The weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation kind of segue into the actual creation of the Constitution. So, why were the Articles of Confederation weak? Well, first of all, they weren't built to be long term. They were built to be the short term government that was able to guide the colonists through the American Revolution. They were able to demand orders, spread them out, spread the word, and direct the military towards certain battles, and pretty much to organize everything. Organize the actual conflict, organize politics, organize the colonies, organize resources. A lot of organization. However, when the government actually needed like their own resources and they demanded things from the states after the American Revolution, they limited their own powers so much that they couldn't really do that. That's why I say here in this left column they have all bark and no bite. They can demand all they want. They can pester the states for as many or the colonies for as many resources as they want. But at the end of the day, it was up to the states on whatever they want to do. If they didn't want to obey the government, they don't have to obey the government. If they don't want to pay taxes, they don't have to pay taxes. That's why I say in this section to the right, no order and discord, they weren't able to, after the American Revolution, they weren't able to help the states. The states couldn't help the government. They couldn't tax. Like, they were restricting their own powers here. And moving back to this left section, I could have organized this better, my bad. But moving back to this left section, this lack of power, this own like self limit shows even further with the inability to set up extensive foreign relationships. So although trade is possible, like, first of all, it's not likely because they're a recovering nation that doesn't really have much to their name and they're new. Second of all, the government under the articles didn't really allow for that kind of extensive relationship, sort of like as a self-imposed limit. And even internal affairs weren't able to be handled properly with shown in Shays' Rebellion. So, Shays' Rebellion, super important because pretty much what it shows is that the Articles of Confederation have a severe oversight in their power. So, Farmer Shay is very outraged, and what he does is that he rebels against the central government because they're not getting reimbursed, they're not getting helped really, because remember, the government is weak, and the states, They can just do what they want. So Shea revolts ends when the states can't quell Shea's rebellion. The government can't do much either because they don't have any power. They don't have their own militia. So Shea's rebellion kind of gets out of hand. Eventually, it's quelled, but this is kind of what highlights that there needs to be a reform in the articles. So after I just talked about why there's like so much of a lack of power within the articles, why would they do this on purpose? Well, it's so that they can avoid another monarchy. The whole reason that the colonists had revolted in the American Revolution is because Britain had so much power over the colonists. The colonists had very little say. They had their quote unquote virtual representation, but that didn't mean anything. Um, they really had no say in anything. They just had to listen to Britain. Take the Navigation Acts. They couldn't do any trade with. They couldn't have free trade. Take taxes. Most like protests against taxes, like the Stamp Act, didn't really go through. So it's pretty similar here, where, well, it's not pretty similar. It's actually the opposite here, where the states have too much power and the government has too little power. So the whole purpose of limiting the government's power is kind of in this fear that if the government of America has too much power, then they'll just spur off and become another replica. They'll become a replica of the British monarchy. So yeah, but now here we're seeing doing that brings its own set of issues that may even be more severe than just giving the government power. So this kind of calls forth the Constitution, where there needs to be a balance between the liberties of the people and the order that the government can bring. And this is where we get our first political parties, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So I kind of made a little list here, as you can see. The Federalists supported a strong central government, believing that a strong central government would be able to bring order to the states. They believed in relations with Britain because that would be most beneficial, as Britain was like the superpower of the world. They had an excellent military and they would meet great allies for that reason, and they had excellent trade and resources for economic endeavors. They supported a national bank as to help the states with their own debts from the war, and they had a looser interpretation of the Constitution, primarily so that they can bring order whenever they see fit, which we'll get into much, much further in the curriculum, but I will always call back to this Federalist point of view. The Anti-Federalists believed in a weaker central government and believed that power, the ultimate say, should belong to the states. And they believed in relations with France, less because of the actual benefits that they would get from France, but more so because France aligned with the states, like ideologically, politically, because France had just undergone the French Revolution and they had just become a democratic state. The Anti-Federalists supported state banks as to just oppose giving the national government a whole bunch of power, and they had a stricter interpretation of the Constitution. So there are four primary issues at hand with the creation of the Constitution. The first of which was representation, and arguably one of the key issues, because the people, the colonial people during the times of the colonies didn't have any representation. So the question of how are the new American citizens going to be represented was an urgent one. The next issue was government power. How do we balance out the powers of the government as to avoid a monarch going haywire with power? Another issue was slavery. I talked about how slavery was an issue in the land ordinances, but there's even more issues with slavery, which I'll talk more so when we get to there. And finally, the protection of the people's rights. How do we make sure that we don't have another replica of what happened with Britain? How do we make sure that the impressment doesn't happen again? That people will be able to do what they want and have their own pursuit of happiness. So let's go into representation. There were two ideas for representation, the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. So the Virginia Plan advocated for a bicameral legislature, which means that there would be two different houses, two different rounds to go through if you want to have anything legislatively related. It was a more population-based system, and it favored the big states because those big states obviously had a much larger population. The New Jersey plan proposed a unicameral legislation where it would just be one house, and that single house would have an equal representation, and that would favor small states compared to big states, as those small states, even if they had such a minuscule population, would have just as much of a say. Take a state like Virginia during the time, which was one of the bigger states, if not the biggest state during this time period. Um, Neither plan was truthfully completely accepted, but a great compromise occurred in the Connecticut plan, where they would stick with a bicameral legislature, except they would have one round or one house be population based, being the House of Representatives, and then a different house be based off the equal representation round that was suggested in the New Jersey plan. So that way, bigger states more representative of the population and smaller states with a more equal say upon issues could be represented. So it kind of just combines the two plans into one. And we see this persist even to today, with the House of Reps and the Senate still being a massive part of our government today. Moving on to government powers, this one is really simple. You learned this in like 6th grade. It's just splitting up the government into the legislative, executive, and judicial branch. Thank you, James Madison, who brought this idea from Enlightenment ideals. So, legislative branch, obviously, the laws, everything lawmaking related. Executive branch, the president. Judicial branch, Supreme Court. So, each different branch has their own way of checking out the other, where the judicial branch can counter the president, the executive branch can veto anything from the legislative branch, yada yada yada. You get the point. Because it's just checks and balances. Moving forward, slavery. Slavery is often referred to as a peculiar institution because of how hypocritical it is on America's part. And this belief can be seen as far back as the Three-Fifths Compromise, which was how slavery was handled during the creation of the Constitution. So, the whole Three-Fifths Compromise stems from the fact that slaves were only counted as 3/5 of a person in a state's population, which was going to be important when considering the representation side that we just discussed and how these bigger states had more power in the House of Reps. So, slaves are only seen as 3/5 of a person, not worth a whole person. So, the whole issue becomes like, how could this how could this nation so based in freedom and liberty make their own make some of the people living in that nation not worth a person? They're pretty much putting them down, and this kind of sets up this long-standing sentiment that slaves aren't like they aren't worth as much as a white American, and we're gonna see this persist up until the Civil War, and even past the Civil War. But for this specific time period in this situation, the main thing about slavery to note is the Three-Fifths Compromise and how that kind of sets up this long-standing sentiment on slavery and African Americans not being as as important or as of value as an American, well, quote unquote American, a white American. Protection of rights. So, how do we make sure that our own liberty isn't infringed? We embed it into the Constitution, our own rule book for the nation. And this is shown in the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments present in the Constitution. The main ones I want to point out are the First and Fourth Amendments. The first one, we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We know that. Fourth Amendment, the government cannot infringe on a citizen's personal life. Fourth Amendment is going to be broken many times throughout history, which brings up its own set of controversy. But that's why I want to point it out, because it's important to take note of it here. And I'll make many callbacks to it. But just know that was how rights were protected through the Bill of Rights. And these are only applicable to American citizens, white Americans, not to slaves. So again, we see slaves and African Americans not truly having the same liberties that America preaches that they fought for, which makes the whole system of slavery very odd and hypocritical. Some other things to note: Hamilton, Hamilton and the National Bank. This was promoted by the Federalists, as I said in that little chart that I made with the Federalist ideals. So, Hamilton's plan with the National Bank, Hamilton's plan with the National Bank was kind of just to make this large bank that would handle and circulate money and pay off war debts of the states, so that everything can be done in an orderly manner and that we can have a universal currency in America. Although it was kind of seen like as this British monarchy-esque thing, because remember the Currency Act, which kind of just enforced the British, which also enforced the British currency, like it was deemed necessary and proper for national stability and for the economics of America. So although it was seen as this very central government based, very like central power based institute, it was like ultimately very important and necessary. The Judiciary Act of 1789, all that did was kind of establish the Supreme Court, establish the justices, the Chief Justice, and again, it was a primarily Federalist institute, which we'll get into in the beginning of the Unit 4 video with John Adams. And the final thing that I want to note is that the church and the state were separate, which isn't, I think that goes without saying considering how primarily around the world that was kind of something being advocated for with the Enlightenment and the Protestant Reformation. This marks the end of the second video, where I don't think it's that long. I don't think it's as long as the last video, but yeah. Next video, I'll be covering the Washington's presidency and John Adams' presidency. I will see you guys then. Bye bye.